All right, so we're going to begin the day with going over some key materials. So what we're looking at here is basically three different brushes. You have a small brush, a medium brush, and a large. And then to the right is a palette knife. We'll talk more about the palette knife in a moment. Here is our palette. So a palette is a fancy way of saying mixing surface and the place where we have our paint kind of laid out. And ours is laid out in a particular way, starting with white first, and then moving into the warm colors. So yellow, yellow ochre, red, crimson, and then it shifts to the cool colors, so the blues, the greens, the browns, and lastly we have black. You all will receive a reference photograph, so you're working from a photograph. I'm working here from life, which means I was actually looking at that still life setup in person, so it's three-dimensional. I can touch it. That's a little bit trickier than working from a photograph. The good thing about photos is they kind of flatten the scene for you already, which is why you'll be working from a photo. Most representational paintings always begin with kind of an outline phase. So that's what we're going to do here. You can decide which medium you want to use, so what material you want to use for your outline. Some artists like to use a pencil to outline. I'm using a vine charcoal twig. Other artists will use a thin application of paint, so they'll actually draw with paint. All of those are acceptable. I'm using vine charcoal because I want you to be able to see my outline and it to be like obvious from your vantage point. And that central line is just a dividing line to make sure that what happens on one side of the pear happens to the other, so it doesn't turn out kind of wonky towards the end of the process. Because what happens on one side in general kind of happens to the other. The great thing about drawing a pear is that a pear is a free form or an organic shape. So that means it's a little bit more forgiving than a pure geometric shape. Technically, a pear is sort of a hybrid form. A form is a shape that's 3D. You have a sphere at the bottom half, like a tennis ball, and then the top part is kind of like a cone. So you need to think in terms of 3D terms when painting. The pear itself, the cast shadow, I would go ahead and outline where the form shadow is going to go, which is the shadow that's on the object itself. And then I would also outline where the highlight is going to go. The reflected light you don't need to outline, but you will need to paint that in. Now you may be wondering, why is there already color on this canvas? That is called a tone, and we tone canvases so that they are not bright white. So it's really hard to check for value and color accuracy on a bright white canvas. So the majority of artists will put down a tone color. Now I'm going to show you a little bit about how to mix colors, because you have colors at the top, but it's always a good idea to mix your own colors. If you use the pure color that's at the top of your palette, it's going to be very predictable and kind of boring and childlike. So you want to make your own colors. So you can take some of the green and some of the yellow to make the shadow side of the pear. I'm going to be adding some other colors to it because a pear kind of has an earthy tone quality. So I'm adding some yellow ochre, which is that yellow-brown color, and even a smidge of red to it because you want to calm down that green. So you want to practice color mixing a little bit. The thing about acrylic paint is once you have a color you like, you need to be able to use it right away because it dries pretty fast. So once you have that color down, you can go ahead and apply it to the canvas. When you go to use your brush, it's really important that you only dip into the paint a little ways. So you're only dipping in the first third of that brush. So you can see that's what it looks like. With these brushes, that's a medium brush there. You can drag the brush sideways to get a broad stroke, or you can turn it so that you can get a narrow stroke. So that's going to be important that you can get a variety of brush strokes using the same brush. So artists should be able to do this too, which is to go from thin to thick, thin to thick. And you do that by twisting your brush between your fingers, so your thumb and index finger. You want to hold the brush farther back than you'd think. It's not like a wooden pencil. You're not trying to write. you need to hold it kind of like a wand, and you need to kind of have a relaxed grip on it so that way you can turn and get some motion into your wrist too, because you really want to get a feeling of flow. Here's what it looks like when I paint. I'm doing a lot of twisting to get a curved mark, and curved marks are going to be important for that pear. Here's how I color match too. That's the photograph, and I'm holding up my palette knife to the photo, and I close one eye to make sure that I'm squinting and can compare the color on my palette knife to that of the photograph. Here's what my palette looks like. I like to put my similar values side by side so I can compare them. So I'm trying to work on midtones. Midtones are the range of green right in the middle, not too dark, not too light. I'm going in and starting to apply paint. One thing you want to think about is applying short strokes that curve or wrap around the form. You can see there's my reference that I'm looking at up on the screen, and then I'm trying to look at that and mimic it onto the actual pear. And keep telling yourself, I'm trying to recreate a form. It's not a flat shape, it's something that's bulging out and curving. Now I was using only the medium brush, but now I want to use that medium brush to get to the light side. So I need to swish my brush in that water, and then I have to wipe very thoroughly both on the rim and on that paper towel to make sure my brush is clean and I don't want it to be saturated with water. Okay, I'm just about to go into the mid-tone range, again still with the medium-sized brush, and not putting down a huge thick layer of paint. It's still rather thin. I just want to show you what I'm doing with my eyes to try and figure out what value goes where, and that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm squinting and blurring it out on purpose. So artists do this all the time to be able to determine things like hue, value, saturation. So it helps me to decide how light I need to go, but also the exact temperature of that color. Now I intentionally started with the pear because the pear is the star of the show, and if possible, you'd want to get a second coat of paint on that pear, and I want to give my most attention and focus to the pear alone. The background doesn't need to have that kind of level of detail. So in the background we can kind of play and go with a bigger brush and maybe looser, more gestural kind of strokes. An up close of what I'm doing with the stem. So the stem, I have to tell myself it's not just a flat twig, it's a cylinder like a straw. So I'm going to have to render that as a cylinder would need to be. So I have a dark side, a medium side, and a light side, and I'm paying attention to my image, what I'm looking at, and I'm trying to color match accordingly. For the highlight is a shiny reflective surface. You see this oftentimes in eyes where there's like kind of a sparkle. So I tell my students to kind of look for that sparkly area. That's your highlight. Highlights, you don't want to ever use pure white, even though it's completely tempting to do that. You always want to flavor the white with a little bit of color. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm adding yellow, and then I'm going to have two versions of that highlight, a lighter value and a little bit darker with a little bit of green mixed in. And that's where I will switch to my skinny brush. I did use the small skinny brush for the stem too. So things that are fine details, you use a skinny brush for. One of the biggest mistakes artists will do is they'll go right for the small brush first, and it's almost always a better idea to go with a larger brush than you think. Here's the pear with one layer of paint. If we have time, we can put a second coat. In the meantime, we're going to go to the background and the foreground. Foreground is the front of the painting. You may only have just a background, but some of you will have two planes, a foreground and a background. So here's the color I'm mixing. I'm using that kind of coral cloth, and I'm going for the darker values first, which is what we're seeing here up on the screen. That's just an image of my palette. But the good news is a background means going loose and quicker. I'm working from dark to light, so I'm seeing that little cast shadow beneath the pear, and I'm going to go in and start to do my cast shadow first. That's the shadow on the same side as the form shadow on the pear, and it's kind of leaning away. On mine, it's leaning to the left. If you can see any creases in your cloth, try and make your brush stroke go in that same direction. So when you lay down paint, try and mimic that a little bit. The background can be even more loose. So I'm looking at the cast shadow. There's a little bit of a cast shadow that's flipped onto the background. So I'm getting that in with some gray. By the way, for gray, I'm not using black and white. I'm using blue plus white plus red plus yellow. Those colors should be familiar to you. They're the primary colors, and that's how I mix my gray. So when you're talking about color mixing, everything is about certain ratios. It's almost like a science. So if you put too much blue in, it'll lean the whole mixture more like blue-gray. Or if you put too much red in, the same thing. So it's all about ratio. The background is where you should switch to your biggest brush you have. You want to go fast and loose, and it does not have to be perfect. It's a great place to like daydream while you work, or like talk to somebody while you're working. So think of it more as kind of like an abstraction of what you're looking at. You might have some grays, you might have some pinks or other colors in there. Try and look for any colors, other colors that you see within that color. Maybe the local color of it is maybe a gray cloth or a yellow cloth, but try to see little flickers of other colors. If you want that line between the foreground and the background to kind of stand apart and be very vibrant, you should consider what's called a chromatic edge. Now, Morgan is really good at this, so I would call her over and ask for some input on how to create this kind of edge that gives a sense of color and fun and exuberance to your piece. If you have time, go back in and put a layer 2. I tend to work very thin at first, and then I build with each successive layer. I put on more paint and I try and get a little bit more information with each layer. So a true acrylic or oil painting usually has like several layers. I put 3 to 5 layers on my work. Most painters will do that. There's also a different method called direct painting where you can do it just in one layer, but you have to be confident and you have to apply the paint thickly. So I am going to show you what a layer 2 looks like. In my opinion, if I were trying to make a finished work, I'd put 3 layers on it. So this is meant to be fun. Don't feel bad if you make a mistake. I certainly make mistakes to this day, and I'm sure Morgan does too. So if you need help, call one of us over. You also have a special attendant for each table, and these are students who have experience and are here to help you with color mixing or paint, like laying down the application of paint. They can give you pointers if you want tips. So utilize the resources in the classroom.